Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Therapy with Ari, where we talk about the mind, the heart, and everything in between. I'm your host, Ari, and in today's episode, I want to explore a question that's been close to my heart for over a decade, a topic that's been the driving force behind all of my personal interest in psychology, and the reason why I decided to pursue therapy as a career. In my own life, this question started as a pursuit for happiness. Or to put it differently, I wanted to find out why I was so damn unhappy with my life, even though I had a good job, a good relationship, and lots of material wealth at the time. Eventually, as I started to ask myself some of the difficult questions about what happiness means to me, what I want to achieve in my life, and what's stopping me from going after those things, I started to realize that this question was the start of a much deeper, more personal search for psychological maturity. I started to realize that happiness isn't a place that I would just arrive at one day after I did some special set of activities or exercises. I understood that happiness is a state of mind which depends on the level of emotional and psychological maturity that I would be able to attain as a person. All of my work on myself, as well as with the people in my practice, revolves around this idea of psychological maturity, how to recognize the process of psychological maturation, where we are along this process, and what steps we can take in order to progress forward. Unfortunately, way back when all of this was going on for me, I didn't really have someone that I could turn to for advice. And YouTube wasn't really a thing back then either. So I had to go through a haphazard process of discovery, both externally and internally, until I was able to find some ideas that really did work for me and help me to find and walk along this path of psychological maturity. This pursuit is a lifelong one and doesn't really seem to have an endpoint, at least not for me. But having had to discover many of these ideas for myself by trying new things and failing at many of them really taught me to evaluate ideas about happiness and well being from a practical, day to day perspective. I learned to ask myself, do I actually feel better about myself and my life and the person that I am? Or is this just another short term band aid solution that will eventually wear off? Or will I realize that I was going down a false path all along? So buckle up, as we're going to be talking about some of the most interesting and difficult topics in what I like to call practical psychology, which are both profound and useful at the same time. I remember a period of about 6 months in my early 20s when I suddenly started to have a massive increase in my sense of self awareness and self consciousness. Neuroscientists will tell you that this is right around the time when the circuits of your brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, finish their development. The prefrontal cortex is seen to be the seat of the self, the voice in the head. Now, all of this is overly simplifying the whole thing, but suffice it to say that for me, this voice in my head sort of woke up and turned its attention inward right around the age of 23. For me, the process was kick-started because I was just so unhappy with my life. And as we'll see, this kind of psychological suffering is actually a great catalyst for the process of psychological maturation. At that time, I had all the things that I'd been told are important for success and happiness in my life, but found myself more miserable than I've ever been, and I couldn't figure out why. Looking back, now I realize that this was the first step in the process of self-development that every emotionally mature adult has to go through in one form or another. Of course, not everyone's path is going to look the same as mine. But this period of questioning is an important part of the first stage of psychological development, what Jungian psychologists would refer to as the mythical fight with the parents. This is the separation from the mythical great mother and the rejection of the mythical great father, which are stages of pushing away what is comfortable and known in pursuit of something that is dangerous and unknown, but is mine because it was discovered by me. The separation from the great mother is really just the act of putting aside all that was comfortable and easy in childhood. The world that was prescribed by our parents for us, wherein we had no difficulties and no responsibilities. A world that was safe and sheltered. It's female coded, the Great Mother, because typically this type of protection is seen to be motherly. But don't let the language confuse you. We're talking about a psychological process of maturation. I also recognize here that this was not everyone's childhood, and I don't want to minimize any suffering that anyone watching this video might have went through. It just means that those people were forced out of this childish state much sooner than they should have been. A lot of childhood trauma is just this, a premature ejection out of that cocooned and protected state that is necessary for children and young adults to develop properly. Even though this protective state is a necessary part of our development as human beings, it's also a roadblock in the process of psychological maturation. The trouble and danger with what's psychologically referred to as the Great Mother is that it's soothing and comfortable, and there's really not a lot of reason to want to step out of that childish state of dependence and out into the real world, at least not on the surface. It's easy, it doesn't require the difficulties and dangers of stepping out and creating a so-called castle for yourself, and it also doesn't give the benefits of being the king of that castle either, so to speak. You don't get the opportunity to create something that is truly yours, that you fought for and sacrificed for, and that you're immensely proud of. This is the first and most important step towards a state of self-actualization or psychological maturation. And without this step, no further step is possible. Now, the next step, the fight with the mythical father, is the other aspect of the psychological separation from the great parents. It's the rebellion against tradition, authority, and fixed meanings and systems that, while functional and important, are again not mine. They're prescribed and rigid, and they don't give us sufficient room to be, such that we get to discover the limitations of ourselves and build something from scratch. A lot of the resistance to what's called the patriarchy in today's cultural shift is actually just this rejection of the Great Father, which on the one hand has blessed us with the quality of life that we have and enjoy in this world today, and on the other hand is corrupted and old and based on rigid rules and laws that tend to suffocate. Whereas the fight with the Great Mother is leaving the comfortable cocoon that's nourished us and raised us into a healthy adult, the battle with the Great Father is the act of rebellion and revitalization that is required for the advance of civilization. The throwing out of the old systems that are no longer serving us, and more importantly, the creation of new systems that will serve us better than the old ones. Unfortunately for us, the act of throwing out is much simpler than the creation of something new and better. And so, looking at history, we see many attempts at this process, what's called the hero's journey, which have failed miserably and have created hell on earth for those who have to live through them. And so, once we've gone through the psychological process of rejecting the great parents, we find ourselves alone in the wilderness of our mind, without a cocoon to protect us, and without any guiding principles to help make sense of this hostile world that we find ourselves in. Again, looking at the state of the world today, we can see how much of the old traditional world order has come to be rejected, and we can collectively feel the resulting anxiety, depression, and aimlessness that results in a loss of that guiding principle that our psyche seems to need in order to function properly. The hero's journey is where the constructive and thus the more difficult part of this process of psychological maturation starts. Like I said earlier, it's relatively easy to reject than it is to construct. Don't get me wrong, the process of rejection has its difficulties, and many people fail to let go of the comforts that the great mother and great father psychological archetypes bring, both psychologically and physically. But relative to this, the process of constructing something new from nothing is an order of magnitude more difficult. It requires self-knowledge, an abundance of understanding of the world and the nature of how it works, and the will and grit to push through the often years-long process of difficulty and building and perfecting something to the best of your abilities. And that's not to mention the skills that you have to learn and the failures that you have to regularly put up with. But even though all of this sounds daunting, difficult, and downright unpleasant, there is a reason why, at the end of every mythical story about the hero's journey, is some sort of magnificent prize worth pursuing, whether it's a priceless treasure or the mythical bride to be. And for the females who may be watching this video, please don't get lost in the masculine coded language here. The hero's journey is for both genders, and the prize at the end is not a literal treasure or a literal bride. It is actually the state psychologically of having accomplished something extremely difficult and the feeling of wholeness, the marriage of man and woman that comes from undertaking such a difficult task. The man who undertakes the hero's journey is confronted with the difficulties of his own emotions, the feminine within, which he has to fight and tame and win as an ally in order to be able to unite with her psychologically and make himself more whole. This is why so many of the men's movements in today's world are, at their heart, repulsive, because they're not encouraging the creation of whole men, but are tending towards a caricatured image of an authoritarian man, someone who tries to bend the will of others by the use of force. This is a way of being that's inherently unstable because it doesn't create allies of the people around you. It actually creates enemies. And in the same way, the woman who undertakes the hero's journey is confronted with the masculine within herself and has to win him as an ally too in order to create a higher level of wholeness in herself. Jung called this process of discovering and integrating the opposite halves of the psyche, the feminine for men and the masculine for women, the hero's gamos, which just means the sacred marriage. He believed that this union of the opposites within the boundaries of one individual psyche is an absolutely essential part of psychological maturity and an imperative in the process of individuation. We know today from studies of the brain, again, much oversimplified, but still instructive, that the two hemispheres in our brain operate simultaneously, but process information completely differently. We know that the left hemisphere is more object-oriented, it's analytical, and it's verbal, which tracks well with the masculine seat of the ego in Jungian terms, and whose aim is the hero's journey and separation from the unconscious. Again, don't get this mixed up with gendered language. Men and women both go through this process of the hero's journey, and it's just that particular part of their brain that tends to undertake this journey. And conversely, the right brain is context-oriented, it's holistic, and it's attuned to non-verbal meaning, empathy, and metaphorical and imagistic meaning making. And this tracks well with the feminine, holistic totality of the psyche, which Jung called the self, and which transcends the ego. Again, don't get lost in the gendered language. Men have to also go through this process as well and possess that part of their own brain. This is important because even in the language of the last paragraph, we can see some potential for misunderstanding, for comparing, and thinking that one side is better than the other. This is just a relic of our cultural tendency towards masculine forces, which was a necessary corollary for the ego to escape the unconscious, but which is incomplete in and of its own, and needs the sacred union with the other half, the feminine, in order to transcend both halves and create something greater than the sum of its parts. Even now, we can see a shift away in our culture from the masculine and towards the feminine, though not in a sacred union, but more in a terrible rejection, which in my opinion is one of the great tragedies of our time. Men and women are more polarized than ever and have come to reject all that is holy in one another in ever greater numbers, rather than uniting to learn the best that each has to offer and creating that holy union, a relationship wherein the two work together to create something great. And to make a long story short, this is why I'm so deeply interested in working with couples in my therapy practice. I want to help each side see this fact and to understand the historically important psychological task that they're confronting. It's, of course, not an easy undertaking, as we all know from seeing how hard it is to create and maintain a healthy relationship. But my belief is that if we come to understand the things that I'm mentioning in this video about separating from the past in a healthy way and looking for a better future together, both on the personal level and in relationships with one another, we can step forward into the next stage of psychological and species development possible on this planet. Now, I know I started this episode with the question of how to be happy. And boy, have we gotten away from that starting point as we've explored the question of psychological maturity. But here's where it all ties back in together. Being happy and fulfilled in life is the result of this pursuit towards psychological maturity. So many people these days are told that if they were just able to make a little bit more money, to buy that next object that they crave, or to have that newest experience on the other side of the globe, that then finally they'd be fulfilled and happy. And while I don't personally reject the pursuit of a better life or grand experiences, I do not believe that on their own, those things have the power to make us fulfilled. That feeling comes from within, from a place of wholeness and psychological strength that comes from the completion of the hero's journey within. Now, I know that in this video, I introduced a lot of new ideas that were fairly deep and often require a lot of explanation. My hope here was to introduce this idea of psychological maturity more generally at first, so that we could have a good overview of the subject before diving into more specific aspects in future videos. So thanks for tuning in to this episode of Therapy with Ari. And I hope to see you in future episodes where I'll go into more depth about many of the ideas that I introduced in this video. Until next time, thanks for watching.